Good afternoon, Amy Shaw. Thank you on behalf of the St. Louis Press Club for being with us for this interview. Today is July 14th, 2020. COVID cases are rising. This pandemic has created havoc, mayhem. So tell me, first of all, how are you doing as CEO and president of the Video 9 network?
Yeah, thank you. I became the CEO on February 4th. Prior to that time, I had been the interim CEO. And so I think most people are aware that I became the interim CEO after Jack Galmish's passing in April of 2019. So, the station, we've been used to dealing with crisis. And so we were really figuring out all kinds of new things for a while. And the idea that we now hired a new CEO, and it was me, I felt really good about all of that. We were supposed to be smooth sailing. And so March came and we had our quarterly board meeting, and then we were talking about COVID, and the next thing you know, everything was shutting down. And so we've weathered it. And I will say, as the new CEO, I was prepared but unprepared at the same time for what that meant for our staff and our teammates, and what it meant for our work, and also what we would be called upon to do. And so I feel very proud of our team and how we've rallied and responded to what the community needs during this really unprecedented time. I know everybody talks about the level of new realities, but it truly is on a daily basis. There's something new that we have to deal with.
I'm going to go back to some of those points in just a moment, but I would like you to explain your business model and your relationship with the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, especially during these times. Please.
Sure. So our business model is we are your local PBS station. So we serve the St. Louis region. We're the only PBS station here. We are licensed to the community of St. Louis, meaning that we are governed by a representative board of individuals who act as the proxy for the community. And we feel very fortunate to have that model to be licensed to the community. I think it offers us a high degree of flexibility to be relevant to what our community needs. In terms of how we're funded, 90% of our funding comes from the St. Louis region, with about another 9% coming from the federal government via the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. The Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 created a mechanism through which federal funding comes to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is a corporation that then issues funding to public broadcasting entities. How we get that funding is through a very complex formula based on our level of community support, based on the work that we do. And so the better your work, the more you're funded locally, the more you're able to get through that formula. But our funding is about 9% of our budget. And our budget varies between $10 and $12 million each year, depending upon what's happening at any given time. This year, because of COVID, we were able to get some additional resources through the CARES Act. We were able to receive an additional $200,000 in funding, which was very much needed because of the pressures on our budget, because of COVID, because of reduced sponsorships. We cannot do any in-person events, which normally this would be very high season. We probably would have done about 25 events by this time in the summer, but we can't do any of those. We also shut down all of our productions, moved our productions to virtual. So we're doing Donnybrook and Living St. Louis all virtually. We were unable to execute some of the work that we would have normally been doing, creating new content and telling stories, because we can't get into the places where we would normally tell those stories. So funding that would have supported the organization during that time had to be held. So the additional funding was really appreciated. But it's a very small amount, and it's a really tremendous public-private partnership. But we're very fortunate to be well supported by our community, and we strive every day to be worthy of that support.
Very nice explanation. Thank you. about the extraordinary education outreach that you have been doing during this time. And of course, it goes back to that founding notion of education.
Yeah.
How did you build that network?
So yeah, we went back to our roots. How Nine was founded was, moms and PTA members going door to door soliciting money to support launching a station, even before PBS went on the air. And so we were one of the first community licensed public television stations in the country to go on air, well supported by the community, and we taught on TV. That's what we did. So as the COVID crisis loomed, and as it appeared very clear that schools were going to be moving to a remote environment, and that was during a lot of schools' spring breaks, so they had to rally. We convened, through the help of some education leaders, we convened a meeting via Zoom and said, listen, we have a tremendous amount of resources. We have a lot of history in education. How can we be helpful? And the education leaders said, yes, you can be helpful. Here are 3 key areas. First was they were very concerned about younger learners who are not used to a remote learning environment. And so what could we do there? The second was, hey, we're really concerned about equity. The fact that 21% of students in the state of Missouri do not have access to reliable internet and or devices is a really concerning number. And the number in the St. Louis region is somewhere around 1 in 3 kids don't have access to reliable internet and or devices. So you're talking about inequitable distribution of resources that's going to really impact how kids are going to be able to learn in this remote environment. And also just the difference between all the different districts of how they're responding to this. And the third thing they were really concerned about was supporting parents, that parents were going to have a really hard time taking control of their kids' learning. And so initially we created, we wanted to mobilize very quickly. So we created an educator and caregiver toolkit that was mounted within less than a week, which compiled all the PBS Kids resources on air, online, in print, everything that would be viable for a parent or a caregiver or a child to support them in their learning. And obviously we have a tremendous history of PBS Kids content. So we also, on air, before every PBS Kids programming, we put a slate that described what the learning outcomes were, what the goals were, and what the curricular areas were. So that as a parent, I would know that this is really good for reading, or this is really good for math, or it's designed around character education, and what the learning goals were, so that we would really reinforce the value of those programs educationally, that they weren't just frivolous for their kids or just entertaining, that they're very educational. We then, again, took the two learnings there and went back to those education leaders and said, how is this? What is this? Is this working? And they said, yes, this is great. But what we really need is now teaching on TV. And so we quickly worked with those education leaders and those partners, and we put out an open call for educators to teach on TV via Zoom. And so we selected a cadre of 13 teachers from across the St. Louis region, public school districts, charter schools, St. Louis County, St. Louis City, St. Charles County, Illinois side. And we really focused on what were the core learnings that were needed. And education leaders said, listen, science is important, but let's put that to the wayside. Let's really focus on math and literacy, because those are the 2 most important. And since then, we've been partnering with WashU Institute for School Partnership, and they're doing science lessons on Fridays. So we've got literacy, math, and science 5 days a week, 2 hours a day, every day from 12:30 to 2:30. You can tune in, and it's a teacher who's teaching on Zoom, and they're doing core learning around those subject areas for pre-K through grade 4. And, from a production value, they're as good as they can be. But what we're hearing from educators and parents is that they're tremendous learning resources for kiddos, and they've been really well utilized. The ratings and the numbers are extraordinary in terms of comparatively of what those numbers were a year ago during those same time slots. So people really are turning to us to have another form of learning to support what they're doing. And for parents, you can imagine you're trying to teach from home, you're trying to teach your kids, you're trying to do your work. It's a lot. And so having a place where they can work with their kids, that they're not responsible for all of it, but they're working with teachers directly via TV has really been powerful. And we're keeping that going through August, and then we'll likely keep that going through the fall as well, based on the surge and what's happening with schools.
Yeah. So you've built up some tremendous evidence here for grants in the future for this kind of teaching and programming and content.
Yes, and we've been really fortunate to receive some funding, not to cover the full cost of it at this point, but to cover some of the work that we're doing. And I've been really pleased that there's been response from the funding community to say we understand the need, and also locking arms with our great network of partners to be able to distribute education resources. We've been working with St. Louis County Library, for example, to distribute PBS playtime pads. These are basically, think of a tablet, but they're a closed environment, so you don't have to have internet access. It's where all the PBS Kids apps are, and they're great tools for learning. And so we know that that's another way to dismantle the digital divide or to mitigate the digital divide. So yeah, the goal is to keep growing this. And so we'll be spending the next year really listening to educators and parents and education leaders about what's needed and how we can continue to be of service. And really, it's ultimately about how we serve and support the St. Louis region and how we get better as a St. Louis region.
It sounds as if you have helped mitigate the education gap in our community.
It's a big one, and I think it's going to take all of us. And so I'm very proud that we are able to work with a mobilized network of trusted community partners who all have the same aim, which is supporting the learning of our most vulnerable learning communities, but also that benefits everybody. So I think it's really a model for how we move forward as a St. Louis region.
So let's look internally at your staff. Everybody's working at home. You really all paid attention to telling stories, but now from home or at least outside. What are the production meetings? What are they looking like?
So, we were an organization that was already in transition. Again, going from one leadership to a new leadership, and then my permanent leadership or my official leadership in February. So we were already transitioning. And so it was something that I think has been really helpful because it helped us short circuit some habits that maybe weren't as productive. But making sure that everybody was supported at home. We closed on March 20th. Moved everybody to a work environment. I think for some people it's been really easy because they like that ability to work from home. For some people it's a mix, and for some people it's really hard. For me, I'd say it's a mix. I really enjoy being home. It's great. I get to sort of be cocooned here and focus, but also I probably focus better at my office, and I like the routines of that, and I like the collaboration and being with people. And so we knew that we were going to have to build ways for people to collaborate. So as a senior team, we meet every morning, 4 days a week for an hour, sometimes not so much, but just to really stay focused on the priorities of the day and to really respond to what's happening. So right now we're talking a lot about going back to school, question mark, how are kids going to go back to school, which is a really gut-wrenching challenge for education, for districts, for educators, parents, caregivers. This is really a hard time for so many people. What does the future of work look like, given that so many of us are staying home for a while longer than we anticipated? And so that then flows into each of the teams meeting individually. So the production team, led by Jim Kircher right now, our executive producer, convenes that team, but also works with our digital team, works with our funding teams. We also have an impact team that's focused on the work on the ground, that's doing the teaching in room 9 and facilitating that work, so that everybody's bringing their perspective and then reaching out and getting additional perspective from community members, parents, caregivers. And so it's really about how can we be most responsive most quickly, but also how do we make sure that all that content is on multiple platforms, it reflects community voice, it isn't just one perspective. It's a much deeper look and gives more context, depth, insight, and more consistent look at all of those issues. So it's just, the production team is also meeting on a very regular basis. You know, they always had a weekly meeting, but now they're meeting more regularly on Zoom, keeping everybody connected. And then from a technical perspective, you know, content is a technical business. And so how to make sure that servers were working the way that they needed to be, maximizing our upload and download speeds, what do people need at home? And so our IT team was especially helpful, making sure that everybody had the technical infrastructure to be successful there, and making sure that staff had the resources, hardware and software, to make that happen. I think we've really figured it out, which is why we're going to stay working from home a little bit longer. We had hoped to go back into the office with a small group of people the third week of July, and now it's really going to be longer than that. So we're closing indefinitely, but we're still very much open for business and staying very connected via technology and listening to the community and listening to what people need.
You've been nimble, there's no question.
There is, yeah. You know, like Donnybrook had to move to a remote environment immediately. You know, it just wasn't smart to have people producing that show in the studio. It's also not smart to get the Donnybrookers together. So we moved to a Zoom environment, which has been good. And it actually forced us to think about the second half hour of Donnybrook, which has always been a call-in. Now it features a guest every week that's an expert on whatever's happening. And so we've covered racial equity, minority health disparities, the pandemic, obviously from a medical perspective, from a jobs perspective, economic perspective. And we're going to keep doing that. So every week it shifts in terms of who's going to be on the show, but I think it's a much better way to serve the information needs of our community. And we probably wouldn't have moved in that direction as nimbly without the pandemic. So technically, and from a content perspective and a storytelling perspective, we're learning a lot.
Silver linings.
I've become remarkably optimistic despite so many challenges, and just we continue to make lemonade out of a lot of lemons. So that's what we're doing.
So the audience, well, television people are notorious for wanting to get the audio absolutely to perfection, the video absolutely to perfection. So, you know, how do you all deal with those sensibilities, and then having to take into account all the different, you know, variables with Zoom, for instance?
Yeah, I think good enough has become a new way of thinking. I mean, you know, 6 months ago, I think it would have been unthinkable to see, you know, the NewsHour or Stephen Colbert or the Today Show or CBS Sunday Morning doing the kind of production that we're seeing now on Zoom with less than optimal audio, less than optimal video. But I think people's expectations have relaxed a whole lot because we needed the content and those stories needed to be told. And so I think people's appetite for the content outweighed their desire for perfection when it came to content, both from the producer standpoint and from the audience standpoint. So I think it's been a good thing, actually, because I think it's that silver lining again. It's allowed us as content creators to think of all kinds of new ways of telling stories and ensuring the stories got out there versus the perfectionism of content. And I think that's going to continue to iterate. I also think the audience's appetite has changed. You know, they really don't. I think it's been fun for the audience to see our home environments. You know, the NewsHour did a whole social media thing on the pets of the NewsHour. And, you know, here's the NewsHour staff reporting these like incredibly consequential stories, and their cats are on the couch behind them or dogs are behind them. And so, you know, I think our appetites have changed as consumers of content and as producers of content. I don't think that's a bad thing. I don't think it's going to last forever. And I really feel for all of the, you know, long form series that are running. That's a really hard thing to think about, how you produce that content now in a socially distant environment, how to be safe and healthy. It's going to be a different time for a long time.
So getting back to you, your new leadership, even though you have been in essentially that leadership for a very long time, but did this put a damper on your short and long-term plans as the new CEO?
Yeah, that's a great question, Jessica. I think it actually crystallized, what was essential versus what was nice to do. And so I actually appreciate, so the FCC requires a search for a public broadcasting station. So we did a very big search. We had a search firm and our board executed that search, which was hard, to be the interim CEO and to have had that aspiration to be the CEO and having been the number 2 person at the organization for a while. It was hard to go through that, but in retrospect, it was really the most beneficial thing because it forced me to be very clear about where I thought the future of the organization is and the value of our work, and not be complacent about taking anything for granted or assuming anything. I had to be really explicit about what our values were and where we were going. And then that doubled down during the pandemic. Having that anchor of knowing who we were helped us be very clear very quickly about what we were going to spend our time on, what we were going to say yes to, what we could say yes to, how we were going to use our resources. So actually, I think it has been beneficial. I also think it's been beneficial because it's forced a level of vulnerability that may have not been there in terms of my leadership, being able to say, hey, I joked early on, listen, this is my first global pandemic, and you don't know because there's no roadmap for how to act during this kind of international crisis and how to support our staff. And so it's also forced me to be very focused on the needs of our staff. And so we had 3 key areas that were my platform, if you will, in terms of getting the CEO position and executing that role. And then I adjusted it slightly, just deepened it based on the pandemic, and with the first priority being the safety, health, and well-being of our staff, knowing that if we are not taking care of those people that make all this happen, we're not going to be able to support our community or to do the things our community needs us to do or that we're being asked to do. The second one is really the education needs of our community, supporting our learners, especially our most vulnerable learners, and using our skills and resources and assets accordingly. The third is really the information needs and entertainment needs. We heard very clearly, very quickly, we also need a break from all the heavy. Give us some things to be happy about. And so things like Masterpiece, and we did marathons of Masterpiece in Victoria. Thursday nights are history nights with Ken Burns for the foreseeable future, which has been great to bring back that very thought-provoking, amazing content. Right now it's national parks, which is beautiful. Mm-hmm. And then the fourth piece of that is our financial viability. We can only do what we're doing because we have the resources to do it. So we need to make decisions that are very focused on the financial viability of the organization now and going forward. And so I think anchoring ourselves with some key tenets and our values has been really, really helpful. Personally speaking, the week before I was named the new CEO, I was traveling on business and I tripped and fell and broke my shoulder very badly. And so that was also a whole new level of vulnerability. I was traveling with some great colleagues at 9 who took great care of me and got me back to St. Louis. And so I think starting my tenure with like this tremendous injury and being in so much physical pain, and then bringing on a pandemic, it was a little overwhelming at first, but I think also it forced me to be very vulnerable and say where I needed help, and being very clear with others to ask for that kind of help that they needed. And so I think in retrospect, it all kind of worked out the way that it was supposed to. And I probably wouldn't change it. I mean, nobody wants a global pandemic. None of us can really do anything to change that at this moment, other than wearing masks and being considerate of our colleagues and staying distant. But I think I've said this a lot, but a crisis really tells people who you are. How you act in a crisis is more of who you really are.
Amy, we cannot ignore, and you've been so involved in the community for such a long time, besides your leadership, this overlay of the George Floyd.
Right.
So this creates yet another layer for consideration as a leader of your station. Can you address that, please?
Yeah, it's been knocking on our door for a long time, and I think we've had the luxury of not having to pay attention to that, and maybe we thought we were responsive. I would suggest that public media has been very focused on inclusion with content like Henry Louis Gates and really telling stories of African American lives and Black history. But I still think it's not enough. And I think from a local perspective, it's been a mandate for us to be better and to be different. And so I just did a reorganization at 9. And this was already in the works pre-George Floyd, but knowing it was really important that our senior team was predominantly male. Well, it's 4 white men and me. I'm the first female CEO in the 65-year history of 9 Network. And so I just promoted one of our fantastic staffers, Angie Carr, to be our Vice President and Chief Impact Officer. She's the first African-American Vice President at 9 Network. So I think that tells you some things of where we have work to do. We have focused on this very much in terms of internally understanding where our staff are and being very clear that inclusion is going to be one of our key aspects, and not just talking about it, but doing it, and making some real changes in terms of how we engage community and listen to community voices, which we were doing, but not still to the degree that I think was going to make some big changes in our community.
I want to thank you for your candor, your wonderful explanations of where you've been, where you're headed. And I have to say personally, I love when you come on the air and you greet your audience. It has a sense of confidence, I think, that permeates. And so I wish you well. On behalf of the St. Louis Press Club, it's really a pleasure to have had you participate in this series. These are important times, and we look forward to more of the good content and the good sensibilities that you provide at the Video 9 Network.
Thank you. I appreciate the work of the St. Louis Press Club now more than ever. Really serving the information needs of our communities is so important, and I appreciate that mandate of the Press Club. So thank you very much, Jessica. I appreciate the time.
Thank you, Amy.
Thanks.